Good afternoon. My name's Gareth Doherty, and I'm an associate professor of landscape architecture at Harvard Graduate School of Design and a member of the Aga Khan Program Advisory Committee. I'm very happy to introduce this Aga Khan Program virtual public lecture. Professor Laleh Khalili will speak about tankers, tycoons, and the making of modern regimes of law, labor, and finance. Laleh Khalili is a professor of international politics at Queen Mary University of London. Although Professor Khalili's geographic area of focus is the Arab world, she studies the Arab world in terms of its relationship to the rest of the world. Professor Khalili's most recent book, which has just been published, is titled Sinews of War and Trade, Shipping and Capitalism in the Arabian Peninsula, and it was just published last week, I think, by Verso. The book examines the role of maritime infrastructures as conduits of movement of technologies, capital, people, and cargo. Professor Khalili's work draws on both archival and ethnographic methods. Professor Khalili's two first books examine the representations and practices of violence, Heroes and Martyrs of Palestine, which was published in 2007, and Time in the Shadows, Confinement and Counterinsurgency, which was published in 2013. Professor Khalili has also written articles on a range of subjects from the politics of pleasure and gendered subjectivities to trade, collective memory, and the role of happiness in counterinsurgencies, among many other topics. Professor Khalili has an interesting background. She has a PhD in politics from Columbia University, an undergraduate degree in engineering from the University of Texas, and has worked as a management consultant for a number of years. Before coming to Queen Mary, Professor Khalili taught at SOAS for 15 years. Before we begin, a couple of housekeeping notes. Those of you who have been using Zoom lately may notice that this webinar has some different features. Please note that the chat function has been disabled so that we may all focus on Laleh's presentation. Laleh will respond to questions after she has finished her lecture. You, the audience, are welcome to send questions to her at any time during the lecture by clicking the Q&A button at the bottom center of your Zoom window. Before I turn things over to Laleh, I want to mention a couple of upcoming lectures that are part of the GSD's newly launched virtual public lecture series. Mark your calendars for Friday, April 17, Architecture Duo French 2D, Anda and Jenny French, and Saturday, April 18, an online-only screening of Heinz Emigholz's film Gough in the Desert, followed by a conversation with Heinz Emigholz and curator Anselm Franke. All lectures will happen on Zoom and require virtual attendees to register. More information about each event, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. Laleh, thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you very much, Gareth, and thank you very much, the Aga Khan program at the Graduate School of Design. This is actually my first Zoom lecture, so forgive me if I'm a little bit nervous as I'm speaking, and also I'm sitting in my living room, so please also forgive me if you end up seeing or hearing noise from next door as kids are running around around us. In any case, what I would want to do today is to talk about tankers, tycoons, and the making of modern regimes of law and labor. Because of the change in format, I was supposed to be in Cambridge, but unfortunately, because of coronavirus, I'm not able to. I had to cut down the talk, so the finance element has dropped out, but I'll be happy to answer questions about it, should there be any. At this stage, I'd like to begin. And again, thank you very much to the Graduate School of Design for inviting me and for all of you to be here on the Zoom. I wonder how much Zoom fatigue everybody's going through, and nevertheless, you're here. So thank you so much. Okay. In 1967, the British Transport Docks Board commissioned McKinsey & Company, the famous management consulting firm, to produce a report on containerisation. Remember, this is 1967. That year was a cataclysmic year in post-war British history. At the end of 1967, Prime Minister Harold Wilson had decreed withdrawal from the British colony at Aden, where British Petroleum, BP, had its largest refinery east of Suez. That refinery was built after the nationalization of the company's oil refinery in Iran in 1951. Domestically, in Britain, throughout the years, dockers in the country's two most major ports, London and Liverpool, had gone on crippling strikes in order to protest the casualization or the casual hiring process at the docks. They wanted to decasualize the process. At the time, what casual labor meant was that the dockers essentially came to the gate of the docks and they were given jobs for the day. And so the dockers were actually protesting this and wanted something more certain, a kind of a more contractually stable hiring process. As the Minister of Labour, R.J. Gunter, reported to the Parliament, and I quote, "There has been a virtually complete strike of dockers in Liverpool and Birkenhead since 18th of September. In London, the Royal Group, West India and Millwall docks, and to a lesser extent London and St. Catherine's docks, have all been affected. The strikes, which are unofficial, now involve about 16,000 men and have caused serious interference with trade, in particular with exports," end quote. So in this climate, containerization was seen as a major palliative to this unruly and intransigent workforce whose demand for better wages and working conditions was eating into the profits of the shipping companies. Dockside protests around decasualization were restricting the circulation of goods and raw resources that had been so fundamental a factor in the post-Second World War boom in Europe. Now, in this climate, the docks authorities, the port authorities, commissioned McKinsey to write a report about containerization. McKinsey's suggestion was the mechanization of the docks via containers, which it argued would better utilize, and I quote, "material resources through improved process control." More importantly, McKinsey promised that, and this was the crux of the report, expensive labor can be replaced with cheaper capital equipment. The promise of automation as a solution to unruly dockers, McKinsey reasoned, was already proven in another maritime sector. And I quote, "The distribution of petroleum products is highly automated. The combined use of supertankers, high-speed automatic pumps, and large-capacity inland pipelines result in an extremely efficient integrated transport system," end quote. This capital investment inevitably drove a process of monopolization in business structures and economies of scale in the material plant needed for shipping. But McKinsey showed that in the oil industry, these economies of scale had resulted in staggering cost savings of up to 30% per unit. So, really interesting. Why are there not more stuff written about tankers as a kind of a predecessor to containerization? There's an odd tanker-shaped lacuna in both the vast literature on petroleum and the growing corpus of critical maritime and logistics studies. The brilliant literature on logistics, and here I include the work not only of Deb Cowen in her Deadly Life of Logistics and the forthcoming research of Charmaine Chua, but also the much older essays of Alan Sekula. This brilliant work on logistics fits well into the renewed interest in histories of capitalism. But because of its emphasis on global supply chains and how it facilitates value in motion of finished factory products, the transport of crude oil, which is a raw commodity, and even processed hydrocarbons are often left out of the story. In a vernacular sense, the aesthetics of containers, their geometric symmetries, and the dramatic vistas they produce on decks and docks also easily overshadow the inelegance of tank farms and the plain, low-slung liquid bulk carriers they feed. The scholarship on petroleum largely focuses on the production of oil, and the form of circulation most of interest to scholars seems to be pipelines. Only one historic monograph is dedicated to the development of tankers, though of course brief mentions are made in various histories of oil, and interestingly, memoirs of Euro-American tanker captains and crew far outnumber any other form of ship, which is also quite interesting. Tim Mitchell's Carbon Democracy is an exception to the paucity of critical accounts of maritime circulation of oil. In a brief but perspicuous passage of about 3 pages, he outlines the way pipelines were intended to, and I quote, circumvent the wage demands of the teamsters who transported barrels of oil to the rail depot in horse-drawn wagons. This is at the end of the 19th century when Standard Oil was beginning to transport oil out of Pennsylvania. And so the pipelines were intended essentially to displace the teamsters who were the petroleum carriers. Nevertheless, as Mitchell points out, by 1970, maritime transport of petroleum and its refined products accounted for like 60% of global seaborne trade. Mitchell also incisively and concisely shows that, and I quote him, moving oil by sea eliminated the labor of coal heavers and stokers, and thus the power of organized workers to withdraw their labor from a critical point in the energy system. Transoceanic shipping operated beyond the territorial spaces governed by the labor regulations and other democratic rights won in the era of widespread coal and railway strikes, end quote. What I want to do in this talk today is to focus on these moments and places where such limitations and restrictions on the activity of labor worked, and in other places where it didn't. I'll be speaking a little bit about the arbitrage on transnational wages, and also of arbitration, of the role of international commercial law in shaping both labor power and global politics. One of the things that's really fascinating about Mitchell is the way he marries the labor politics to the history of colonialism, and I want to illuminate that a little bit more when it comes to the question of tankers. So the first transoceanic tankers were constructed by a British merchant house, Shell Trading Company, which was owned by a Whitechapel merchant family of Iraqi Jewish origin. The reason that it was called Shell Trading Company was because they had a business with Southeast Asia, especially in Indonesia, and they brought in shells, actually decorative seashells. Herbert Samuel was the first to think of ships crossing the oceans and carrying oil in bulk in their tankers. Before that, the Nobel family, famously of the invention of TNT and of the Peace Prize, had been the first to experiment with these kinds of oil-fueled tank ships, but it only used them on the Caspian Sea and the inland waterways of Russia, where they had their oil fields. So in a way, Samuel of Shell Trading Company wanted to actually deal with longer distances transoceanically and transnationally. What Herbert Samuel was particularly adept at was establishing global bases which could be used for processing various steps of oil production. Oil could be drawn from the fields owned by the nobles or the Rothschilds in Azerbaijan. Then they could be loaded onto British ships in Georgia. Then they could be shipped to Singapore, where destination ports, in order to be able to receive these tank ships, needed a lot of infrastructure. And the kind of infrastructure they needed, for example, was accessibility to road or rail. They needed foundations firm enough on the port for the immense storage tanks to contain the oil. They needed enough room beside them, beside these ports, for the warehouses where the oil that was coming in bulk could be put into barrels for transport inland. They needed piers or jetties in deep water where the new large tankers, and which were the largest at the time, would come alongside. And they also needed to have a good shelter from the violent gales, which were at the time called Sumatra squalls, which could spring up unexpectedly at any time. So you needed quite a bit of infrastructure in order to service tank ships. From the very first, fuel oil-fired tank ships operated on the basis of maximal exploitation of ever-shrinking number of laborers. In fact, the success of the Shell Trading Company, which later merged with an Indonesian oil company and became Royal Dutch Shell, was largely predicated on the kind of wage arbitrage that today characterizes global production. So arbitrage essentially means trying to sort of make it earn money or profit from the difference in costs of something, in this instance labor, in two different locations. So shifting work from places with oft unionized, higher wage workers to places where workers were less protected and demanded lower wages would actually, of course, translate into profits for the trading companies. The Rothschild-Benito company wanted to open the Asian markets to their Azeri oil in order to compete with and try to get a foothold ahead of the Standard Oil of the US. They argued that the benefit of bulk transport of oil was that the oil could be unloaded and packed in the Far East, where, and I quote this from their own documents, an inexhaustible reservoir of cheap labor could fill and pack unloaded oil in fresh, unrusted tin packaging ready for the market. Instead of Standard Oil's petroleum, which was shipped via the Pacific and arrived, and I again quote the documents, in tins grown rusty from the particularly long voyage from Philadelphia by train and ship. In the end, the venture proved highly successful. Skilled Chinese laborers in the Eastern and Southeast Asian ports manufactured tin containers, helped pack them with oil from the tanks, and transported them inland for sale. And they did so at a fraction of the wages of workers in the US or Europe. Wage arbitrage paid handsomely for Benito and Shell, that was actually the trading company for Benito's oil, and opened new markets for oil. It was also in the nature of tanker trade that portside work could be automated from the very first. For example, while emptying the hold of a ship from packages could require dozens, even hundreds of stevedores, loading and unloading tankers required only 3 dock workers. And I'm reading this from a document that talks about what is required, a technical document. You require 1 at the tank farm on the ridge to turn on the main tap, 1 at the switchgate manifold, handling an intricate system of dials by which to guide the required products at the right rate to the separate tankers, a task rendered recently more complicated by the export of refined products as well as crude, and this is written in the 1920s, and a 3rd person in a little office on the jetty beside the tanker to supervise the loading. So instead of hundreds, you could have 3. In fact, this parsimony in the required number of workers was a major factor in Aristotle Onassis' decision after the Second World War to focus his investments on tankers rather than on ore carriers or general cargo ships like most other Greek ship owners were doing at that time. As one of Aristotle Onassis' biographers writes, and I quote this, tankers were the most automated ships at that time. This is post-Second World War. Hook up a hose, turn a valve, and a tanker was loaded in half the time it would take to pack a freighter's hold using clumsy slings and cargo winches. It took dozens of stevedores to load a freighter, and these men cost money thanks to the strong unions controlling such ports as New York and London. Oil could be siphoned aboard with as few as a handful of men if the unions weren't looking, end quote. The fact that ships had fewer sailors, required fewer dock workers, and everything depended on the speed of the pumps meant that the turnaround time at the port was also much faster for a tanker. As a 1956 report on work aboard tankers commented, and I quote this, at sea, the tanker man lives pretty much as does the freighter man, except that there is more of it. For the big tanker spends little time in port. She's in this afternoon to start spilling out her cargo, and after 18 hours is off again tomorrow for a month or 2. Remember that in 1956, 18-hour turnaround time is unheard of, and most ships that carry dry cargo or general cargo actually spent up to a week in port. And so this was seen as an extraordinary transformation, technological transformation of labor. The quick turnaround time and intense work time at port, the paucity of leisure time, and the distance between oil terminals and the city also translated into a life of isolation. A New York Times piece from 1956 casts a less jaundiced eye on this life of solitude and relative isolation. The New York Times piece says, one advantage in this way of life may be that money He's usually somewhat better paid than the freighter man, and he can save a lot, for there isn't much to spend his wages on. The oil loading ports in faraway lands are isolated, not near the white lights. A man can use up most of his day in port getting to and from the nearest hotspot. Again, this is a 1950s piece, and in which we see that, for example, while the ports that handled cargo in New York would be in Red Hook, and therefore really close to the rest of Brooklyn, shifting oil terminals further outside of New York made it very difficult for the tankermen, for the sailors that worked on the tankers, to actually go into town. This is a complaint that we hear a lot about container ports today. Both government and shipping company records showing such turnaround time at the port of Bahrain, for example, which was between the 1930s and the end of the Second World War, a major loading point for refined products from both Bahrain and oil fields of Saudi Arabia. These reports show that tankers could be loaded or unloaded and sent on their way in fewer than 24 hours. In 1957, the average turnaround time was already down to 18 hours. In a space of a few years, they had reduced the turnaround time. Now think about this. If the turnaround time is reduced, that means that the workers are required to work that much faster. There needs to be some way to force them to work faster and harder. At port, tanker crew are required to be more involved in loading and unloading than on dry cargo ships. And this also shifts the burden of work to the seafarers. Automation had always been the holy grail of capitalists looking to cut costs. Using pipelines certainly served this purpose. Standard Oil's pipelines cut out the Teamsters, and Nobel Oils in Azerbaijan cut out the Cossack Araba drivers of Azerbaijan. But the problem with pipelines is limitation on the size of the pipes, but perhaps even more significantly, the border crossings that make pipelines very vulnerable to geopolitics. More significant still is that pipelines can be sabotaged, effectively acting as a choke point on production. Maritime transport could be scalable. It's more flexible in its carriage capacity, and it is immune to crossing contentious land borders. To make maritime transport of oil invisible so as to immunize it against sabotage, oil terminals were also moved away from city centers. Again, this was an innovation that container terminals followed very closely. In both the case of oil terminals and container terminals, logical explanations abound for moving docks away from city centers. More space for container storage, health and safety reasons for loading fuel on board ships, like, for example, actually this is an excuse often given for transport of crude oil. But what's interesting is that crude oil is so heavy and stable and not considered volatile that in fact it's not really quite as accurate as one would imagine. Single buoy moorings and offshore oil terminals both distance the loading and unloading of tankers from city centers and making the ships less subject to sabotage or attack, but also away from population centers where politically irrepressible crowds of workers can be supported by the population. This attempt to automate workers out of existence wasn't always successful. Even with a handful of people needed at the terminal, the oil companies had to contend with highly skilled workers who could down tools or even sabotage the very expensive equipment. Bringing in scab labor also was not always possible. During one 1968 strike in Qatar, for example, the Qatari deputy ruler offered replacement workers to the oil company, which was a subdivision of British Petroleum. But the oil company politely refused the offer, and I quote from their documents, partly because marine operations could be dangerous with inexperienced workers, and partly because the company did not wish to provoke sabotage on its equipment, end quote. But also, oil brought out from underground is of no use if it cannot be circulated. And the shipment of oil is dependent not only on dockers, terminal workers, and seafarers. In 1961, during a 2-year strike again in Doha, Qatar, pilot boat crews stopped work. Pilot boats are small, powerful boats captained by seafarers with deep and extensive experience of a given port's contours and dangers. And these pilot boats help larger tankers berth at the terminal. The strike of pilot boat crews meant that although Qatari oil was produced, once the storage tank at the Said terminal had reached its capacity, oil could not be shipped, nor could it be pulled out from the underground. This meant that the workers, in fact, had quite a great deal of leverage over how much oil was to be shipped. In this case, the oil company was supported by the Qatari government, whose police force violently suppressed the strike. So there is this an enormous amount of coercion that is going on in trying to keep these strikes contained. Also, what is really interesting, and I just have to say this as an aside, is that when one reads some of these older documents, one is impressed by the extent to which oil workers in Qatar and Abu Dhabi in the 1960s in particular were constantly engaged in political organization, political mobilization. And this is a kind of a prehistory of labor organizing that has been forgotten. Moving on, a longer lasting and more insidious method of disciplining labor on tankers was the introduction of flags of convenience, or in effect, offshoring of shipping ownership. Open registries where ship owners can flag their ships to a different country's flags are called flags of convenience. In the words of John McPhee, a wonderful essayist, the convenience being that taxes could be avoided, insurance could be to a considerable extent ignored, and wages attractive to ship owners could be paid to merchant sailors drawn from any part of the world, end quote. The world's most famous flags of convenience are Panama and Liberia, and also Marshall Islands, Cyprus, Honduras, and Bahamas. And there are actually some landlocked countries that have flags of convenience, all of whom, interestingly, are steadfast allies or clients of the US. Open registries, at the time of their devising in the early 20th century, were analogous to concessions granted to British companies by British colonial officials. What do I mean? So in a colony, what you had was British colonial officials that chose British companies to get very lucrative concessions on extractive goods or extractive materials in the colonies. The open registries functioned in the same way. So in places where the US was effective patron of the governments, they would essentially have these open registries, and the open registries in these places, in Panama, in Liberia, and in Honduras in particular, the companies that were set up to manage the ship registries were always headquartered in the US and always operated according to US corporate guidelines. The most egregious was Liberia, where Edward Stettinius, who was Franklin Roosevelt's Secretary of State and first ambassador to the UN, set up a registry whose headquarters are still located in Vienna, Virginia. So the Liberian ships, which is almost all tankers, a huge number of tankers, are under Liberian flag. They pay their registry fees to this company in Vienna, Virginia. And this company repatriates a substantial portion of the fees collected to the US. This was the case from very early on. And when the Liberia company was established, 60% of the profits went back to the corporation. 10% went to a development fund, which the corporation had set up in order to encourage investment in mining in Liberia. And only 25% was given to the Liberian government. As Rodney Carlyle, the prime historian of open registries, writes, for public consumption, Stettinius promoted the operation in non-profit humanitarian terms. For other more specialized audiences, such as investors or Liberia company executives, Stettinius hinted at the profit possibilities that this provided in shipping, but also in the iron deposits at Bomi Hills in Liberia. From the very first, extraction on colonial terms was interwoven with shipping in its most exploitative, profit-maximizing form possible. The earliest ships to be flagged to the Panamanian and Honduran flags of convenience were the banana boats of the United Fruit Company and the tankers of Standard Oil. Standard Oil was the parent company of both Bahrain Petroleum Company, BAPCO, and of Aramco. So the statistics from the port of Bahrain in the late 1930s and early 1940s is really fascinating to see that Panamanian ships outnumbered almost every other ship. These were American ships of Standard Oil that flew the Panamanian flag rather than an American flag. In 1900, 56% of the world's oil-carrying fleet had been flagged to Britain and only 3% to the US. By 1948, 10% of the world tanker tonnage was carried on ships flagged to Panama, but they were US-owned tankers. In 1970, 65% of all tankers flagged to Panama and 40% of all Liberian-flagged petroleum carriers were US-controlled ships. In 2018, the vast majority of the tankers are flagged to the Marshall Islands, Liberia, Panama, and Singapore. The most ironic, in a very terrible way, is the Marshall Islands case. The International Registries, Inc., which works for Marshall Islands and it operates the island's open registry and represents the country also in international maritime conferences, is another US-based company that has its headquarters in Reston, Virginia. What is bitter and ironic about this is that various conferences that have attempted to limit emissions from ships in order to prevent climate change and attendance rise in sea levels, International Registries, Inc., which is the registration company for Marshall Islands, has vetoed any effective action, ironically increasing Marshall Islands' exposure to oceanic inundation. Flagging ships to Panama, Liberia, or the Marshall Islands is not only one way to hide incomes from taxation or polluting machinery from inspection, but perhaps more significantly, it is a way to pay crew members less. The absence of regulatory restrictions means that the ship owners could set wages in ways that best benefited them. Onassis, for example, Aristotle Onassis, was known to pay Greek and German crews better rates than other nations, even if his crew members were underpaid in comparison with US, British, or Norwegian ships of that time, because he could put them on Panamanian registry. US shipping companies had already pioneered moving their fleets to flags of convenience, but when in 1963 the Supreme Court ruled that maritime unions had no say in this, the shifting of fleets accelerated. In 1982, for example, Exxon reported that tankers carrying 28 seafarers had to pay $2.5 million in wages if flagged to the US, but only $560,000 if flagged to the Philippines. So the difference in wages is astonishing. Beyond these forms of wage arbitrage, legal means are also used by transnational petroleum corporations as modes of disciplining not only workers, but also oil-producing nations. And the final bit that I want to talk about is the tyranny of arbitration. So the most effective method for protecting the colonial interests of foreign investors in oil and shipping has been commercial arbitration in tribunals usually located in Europe or North America, sometimes through the auspices, much more recently through the auspices of the World Bank's International Center for the Settlement of Investment Disputes. International arbitration has been seen by commercial ventures and foreign investors as a bulwark against the possibility of sovereign post-colonial states nationalizing foreign assets or taking investors to court in national tribunals over unfair or corrupt practices. Though international commercial arbitration was being institutionalized towards the end of the 19th century, and with the colonization and capitalization of the globe, the call for international arbitration by Western capital became much more clamorous in two specific periods. First, following the 1920 nationalization of Azeri oil by the Soviet Union, and especially after the 1938 nationalization of Mexican oil, was the first wave where you saw the foreign investors wanting to create these tribunals as a way to stop these processes of nationalization. And second, in the wave of decolonization that succeeded the Second World War. After the Mexican nationalization, oil companies, in addition to trying to go for these tribunals, added stabilization clauses to their concession contracts, which froze the provisions of the national system of law chosen as law of the contract as of the date of the contract to prevent further alterations. So these stabilization clauses did not allow any amendments to the original concession. And they also began to stipulate international tribunals as the venue for resolution of any such disputes. In 1951, Iran's Mohammad Mossadegh had refused to allow international tribunals to arbitrate his nationalization of Iranian oil. This was enormously important. He really insisted on wanting Iranian courts to oversee the processes of nationalization. But unfortunately, he was not able to. And arguably, the moment during the process of nationalization of OPEC oil, in which the most capitulation to the demands of international companies took place, was when, over the objection of oil insurrectionists, the gradualists, like countries of the Arabian Peninsula, agreed to moving all disputes to international arbitration. This is a wonderful history by Christopher Dietrich of this internal debates within OPEC, talks about this process quite extensively. So international tribunals was a way for foreign investors to hold the whip hand over the states. Of course, arbitration was not the only method used by the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. The company, Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, which was, of course, became BP later, conspired with all other majors to boycott all Iranian oil. There was clear knowledge that without tankers and without Anglo-Iranians' worldwide system of distribution, the Iranians would have no outlet for their petroleum. Not only did the majors boycott Iranian oil, but when a Panama flag ship, which was called the Rosemary, chartered by a private Italian oil company, lifted oil from Iran's Abadan, British RAF planes forced it into the Aden harbor, where its cargo was impounded. So the hijacking of the ship by the RAF had happened at the very moment when AIOC, BP, had forced Mossadegh to attend hearings at the World Court in The Hague. It acted as a great deterrence against other oil companies loading crude in Iran. The Iranian nationalization of oil and its strangulation through denial of shipping was certainly in the back of the powers, in the back of the mind of the powers in the US and the UK when Aristotle Onassis, yet again, comes to the center stage. If you recall, Onassis, as I mentioned earlier, had become a major tycoon through betting on oil tankers after the Second World War. Onassis' astonishing rise and rise through the prosperous ranks of global tycoons gave him a confidence that only one of the world's wealthiest oil companies could deflate. In the 1950s, Aramco, remember Aramco at that point was a subsidiary of Standard Oil of California, had a concession from Saudi Arabia for the production of oil. But its agreement did not specify the terms of export. Onassis attempted to subvert Aramco's monopoly over oil transport by lobbying the Saudi government for an exclusive concession to transport the country's oil. So what he was trying to do was he was trying to move into Aramco's turf, but on the shipping side. This was too much not only for Standard Oil, but also for the de facto masters of oil in the region, the other big European and North American countries. For a time, fear that Saudi Arabia might follow Iran's example and nationalize its oil reigned. Why else would it want an independent tanker company? A motley group of concerned actors, from the CIA and the Dulles brothers to Her Majesty's government in London and the other shipping mogul Stavros Niarchos, came together to defend Aramco against such impudence. Onassis' ships were boycotted by all oil companies, including Aramco's rivals. Diplomats and spies flew to Riyadh to lobby the king to withdraw Onassis' concession. As a last resort, Aramco lodged a case against Saudi Arabia, and by extension Onassis, in a commercial arbitration tribunal in Europe. A powerful group of European and North American lawyers ruled against Saudi Arabia and declared that its oil production concession agreement had given some measure of sovereignty to Aramco. Yep, concession agreements gave sovereignty to Aramco, to a foreign oil company. It was a decision that defended the rights of a powerful Western corporation against countries from the global South that were trying to assert jurisdiction over their own oil and control over the operation and management of their own trade. The tribunal decided that by signing the concession agreement, Saudi Arabia had ceded sovereignty over its oil to Aramco. Justice Stephen Schwabel, a former president of the International Court of Justice, was a young lawyer working on behalf of Aramco in that case. In a later recounting, he declared triumphantly that international investment law and its tribunals, and I quote this, dethroned the state from its status as the sole object of international law. But it did so at exactly the very moment when former colonies became sovereign states. This coincidence of timing was, of course, no coincidence. In part, control over the circulation of oil was seen as the fundamental mechanism for the control of oil itself. After all, after Mossadegh's nationalization of Iranian oil, if he could not sell the oil that was pulled out of the ground, what was he going to do? Drink it, as one brutal wit said at the time. Arbitration was seen as a powerful force for the protection of foreign capital invested in former colonies. And such an early and decisive arbitration as the Onassis tanker case anticipated the primacy of this mechanism of discipline in the coming decades, and particularly after the fall of Soviet Union. In conclusion, in the three-decade period after the Second World War, European states and Japan built thriving social democracies, and decolonization in much of the global South brought with it intense, though non-linear processes of capitalization and industrialization. None of that would have been possible without the maritime transportation of oil. Even today, flying over Gibraltar or Bab el-Mandab or Malacca Straits, the profusion of tankers amazes. We often attend to the logistics of container transport because it is such a clear prism through which to study the global value chains. But the humble and too often forgotten tanker has anticipated the global transformations wrought in the 20th century more than any other. And more than any other, it has held a mirror to the techniques of control and discipline in response to mobilized workers at home and decolonization abroad. In her Accumulation of Capital, Rosa Luxemburg insists that imperialism is about three fundamental characteristics: of loans extended internationally, which I didn't get to talk about, unfortunately, of extraction of natural resources, and of transport infrastructures that take the mined products to the market. She was writing about railroads, but maritime infrastructures are just as crucial. The history of the tanker transport is in every way the story of the global accumulation of capital. Thank you very much, and I would be very happy now to answer any questions that you would have. Okay, so the first question is, can you please provide the name of the writer you quoted from regarding the flags of convenience? Taxes could be avoided. It's John McPhee, who writes essays in The New Yorker. And that particular quotation came from a book that he wrote about going, actually about his own travel aboard a container ship. But also there is a very, the historian of the flags of convenience is a guy by the name of Rodney Carlyle, who's written 2 different books on the subject. And both of those have great deal of detail about the subject. Any other questions that I could answer for you? Hi, Majid. So the first question is, can we argue that Mossadegh was an inspiration to oil nationalization projects in the global South, whether in Indonesia or Saudi Arabia? If yes, why the Saudi ruling family didn't face the same fate as Mossadegh, a coup or dethroning of the family and remaining in power? A really interesting question. Why is it that the Saudi ruling family did not have to face the same kind of process? It's a really interesting moment because actually the internal politics of the Saudi ruling family is fascinating. While in fact there was a coup, the King Saud ibn Abdulaziz, so the second king of Saudi Arabia, during whose tenure, during whose reign, the Onassis case happened. was in fact deposed by his brother Faisal. And in part, this was because he seemed to have had more sympathies to the nationalists, to the Arab nationalists of his time. And certainly during the time that he was in power, a lot of the bureaucrats and government officials who worked as ministers in oil or in finance were actually really quite radical and really, I mean, Abdullah al-Turayqi, for example, was a great Arab nationalist. And these guys, the Arab nationalist bureaucrats, ministers, and young officials were the ones that were sidelined. And as I said, Saud ibn Abdulaziz lost his place to his brother Faisal. And so, in fact, there were internal struggles about this. And we see that effect in that from Faisal onwards, we've only seen kings in Saudi Arabia that have been steadfast allies of the US. Another question from Diane is there a specific entity that is supposed to check commercial arbitration companies on the ethical compliancy of their practices, such as regarding fair labor and wages? Is it determinant on the company's own federal government laws, or is there an international entity that oversees these companies' practices? That's a really interesting question. With shipping companies, by and large, the rules that actually dictate wages, environmental compliance, and other regulation compliance are those of the flag that a ship flies. So I'll give you an example. CMA CGM is a major shipping company based out of Marseille. It has a large number of ships that are flagged to France or Britain or other European states. And it also has a large number of ships that are flagged to Liberia or Panama or other flags of convenience. The ships that are flagged to European flags have excellent, or relatively better, I shouldn't say excellent, but relatively better conditions of work. And they also comply with environmental regulations much more closely. The ships that are flagged to Liberia pay wages that are closer to Liberian wages, et cetera, et cetera. But there is, with some of these bigger shipping companies that want to be in good with international organizations, agreements with, for example, global unions like International Transport Workers Federation that does some inspection of these ships. And if these ships are coming into a particular port, they obviously have to also be compliant with, say, the environmental regulations of that port. So that tends to be some degree of control, but that is extremely thin, because in fact you could have a Liberian ship that goes between Saudi Arabia and Liberia and never touches a British port, and therefore it doesn't necessarily have to worry about British regulations. So that flag of convenience works in that way to actually forestall possibilities of unified regulation across national borders. The next question by Samia. It's nice to know through your work the implication on tanker, sailor, and port worker of location of ports outside the city. Can you speak about the reverse impact of the move of the port on the city center? That's a really interesting question, because one of the things that we have seen is that as ships have gotten bigger, and also as unions have gotten stronger, in particular in European cases, and as you have become, you've become more dependent on either tankers, which often load oil or unloaded offshore, so about a mile offshore, or container terminals where you have to have space for storage of containers. Ports have moved further and further and further out of the city. Perhaps the best example of this is Marseille, where, if you've ever been to Marseille, beautiful city, the Vieux-Port area is now a little tourist destination. The port, the working port, the working cargo port, shifted to further west, And that port is now more or less a cruise ship terminal. And now the working port is 40 miles further west. So this happens in turn in lots of different places. In a lot of the Gulf, for example, you have the old ports that have become thou ports. Some of those are more museumized kind of thou ports intended for tourists. But the one in Dubai, for example, is actually a functioning thou port, which allows for local transportation between closer distances. And then you had the Port Rashid, which is at the mouth of the creek, which was the main port until the 80s or 90s. And that port has now become a cruise terminal. And now the main port of Dubai is Jebel Ali. So you see these gradual shifts. The effect of this is multifold. So on the one hand, it really changes the character of the inner city itself. The inner cities that operated around ports had extremely vibrant lives. And you can read amazing books about this. For example, Claude McKay's Banjo about the Marseille port is an amazing portrait of what that port was like in the immediate aftermath of the World War. And those shifts have essentially transformed the inner cities into touristic destinations. They've resulted in gentrification of those areas and pushing out of the working classes that have lived around there. But it also has had very adverse effect on labor organization. So there's a lot about this written in two books that I would highly recommend. One is Deb Cowen's Deadly Life of Logistics, and the second is Mark Levinson's The Box, which discusses some of these effects on the ports itself. I also have written about this as it regards the countries of the Gulf in my book, Sinews of War and Trade, which hopefully you'll be able to get and reflect on. Thank you. The next question, what is the finance side of the story that you had to skip? So the finance side of the story is actually a reflection on the way that financialization has affected the process of buying of ships. And it also is a kind of a discussion, a critical discussion of the way that certain financial instruments were invented very specifically by shipping companies, and actually Onassis, again, being at the forefront of this. He's a very interesting figure in the sense of being taking advantage of a lot of these. And there are three distinct phases through which this financing process happened. The first of these phases was before the 1950s, before the Second World War. It was an ordinary financing. It was mostly because ship ownership was really concentrated in a fewer number of hands. In the aftermath of the Second World War, Onassis essentially came up with a financial instrument in which he could finance the buying of his ships by essentially using future contracts as a kind of a guarantee in order to get money to build ships. So a future contract on an unbuilt ship acted as a kind of a guarantee for a mortgage, essentially. And then when financialization happened, that completely went away, and that has resulted in a really massive ups and downs in ships being built and then having to be scrapped, because they're often, they no longer have this element of a contractual guarantee, and so loans are given on the back of the ship itself. And so that ends up being an issue. I write about this again in my book a little bit, but there's also a very good article by Elizabeth Sebelius on the subject. If you just look her up, I can't remember which journal, but I think it's in a geography journal. Wonderful, discusses the different kinds of finance that has happened there. Next one. Scott. Considering the many authors who've written about the role of the whaling industry and the emergent 20th century American modernity, particularly in relation to notion of whaling crew in Melville, which I absolutely, Moby Dick is sort of my great amazing book that I followed. I'm wondering if you might speak to what the recent history of petroleum shipping and the formations of labor you've discussed might portend for still emerging 21st century modernity. A quick tangential point, Onassis, in addition to having oil tankers, also owned a fleet of whalers. I mean, the man seems to have had anything to do with any interesting questions having to do with ships. But in terms of what it forbears for a still emerging 21st century modernity, some of the things that I actually discuss in my in the book, and also in a forthcoming article that I'm writing, in the process of writing, is about, what I'm really interested in is how the particularities of shipping, the sort of the isolation aboard ships, the flags of convenience, the loneliness and the massive turnaround time, which is a very different kind of thing than the whaling life of because the whalers had dozens, sometimes hundreds of people aboard, whereas ships today, the 2 times that I went on board ships, enormous ships, the biggest ever ships, had no more than 35 people on them. So it generates a kind of a loneliness. And I write about this in this forthcoming article, which I'm hoping to maybe finish during this summer. What it does tell us is about a condition of labor that, after a very brief blip in the immediate post-Second World War, because of both decolonization and social democracy in Europe and some elements of a welfare in the US, we are returning to extraordinary exploitation of laborers. And in fact, in some ways, the 19th century accounts of a Melville in White Jacket or in Moby Dick, in some ways, the immediacy, the violence, the sense of loneliness, the madness, all feel very real, but obviously at an angle to what was written about the 19th century, and certainly in a context of today's work. So I think that to me is probably the single most important thing. But I also have a fascination with the way that law is shaped, and I do think that shipping and law have always worked hand in hand. I mean, Hugo Grotius fathered in some ways international law on the back of international shipping, and I think that you can see the effects of that today as well, in the sense that today's shipping will say things about the way international law is transported, transmitted, adapted, and used in different parts of the world. So I think those are the 2 things that I would probably respond to. In terms of how religion and Islam has impacted oil trade, I'm afraid it hasn't. It really doesn't make any difference at all. I tend to think that a lot of the kind of emphasis on Islam when it comes to the Middle East, with the exception of political movements, tends to be overblown. And so I don't think that that's really a factor in shipping and trade, not that I can think of immediately anyway. In particular, because the laws that most shipping companies obey are not Islamic laws. Even in countries such as Saudi Arabia, they have civic laws that actually dictate and control such questions as labor, etc., etc. Okay, Quinn, do you end up revising, confirming, or complicating Tim Mitchell's thesis about this empowering effect of oil on organized labor? I love Tim Mitchell's book, and I do think that he's right about a lot of things, but I also, having lived through the Iranian Revolution and seeing the fact that the oil workers' strike in Iran is actually what was probably one of the single most important factors in the revolution coming to fruition, I would say that the effect, perhaps because oil in so many places tends to be an extremely sometimes a single most important component of the economy, I think an oil worker strike actually could be really quite significant. I also think that the thing that Mitchell writes about how the mass presence of loads and loads of miners can be contrasted, for example, with the much more contracted number of people who work in oil transport and production, that observation is absolutely right. But also the level of leverage they have is different, number one. And number two, taking into account the question of circulation changes those numbers significantly, because the circulation of oil, although again, it is much more reduced than, say, when you had to transport the oil in barrels out of ships from one place to another. I do think that actually you still have a lot of people. And I think in part, again, in my book, I discuss this at length, but such things as, for example, a pilot boat crew can have an outsized effect economically on the role of labor and the efficiency and efficacy of a labor strike in a way that we really can't see it even with coal heavers, for example. So I think that I would say that I love Mitchell's book, and I think in many ways I confirm his argument, but I also complicate it in some ways. And I do talk about that. There are 2 whole chapters about the question of labor in the forthcoming book. So hopefully that will answer some of the questions with more detail and more evidence. Rob, thank you very much for the really interesting, thank you. Could you say more about the financial side of these developments? I think I mentioned that a little bit earlier. And I would say, again, I'll emphasize that Elizabeth Sebelius's article in a geography journal came out a couple of years ago. It's fantastic, and it'll outline that. And I also have half a chapter, I think, where I discuss about not only the question of sort of borrowing in order to do infrastructure investment or borrowing for shipping, but I also talk about financial instruments and futures and options and the role that they play in shipping. It is fascinating, and I actually had to become a kind of a student of finance in order to learn how to write about it, how to talk about it, and some of that will be in the book. Davinder, let's see. Where these respective changes in the legal and financial structure of the tanker industry reflected in the history of the trucking industry? Ooh, really interesting question. I would not say that the trucking industry and the tanker industry are analogous. The reason being that a tanker is much, much, much more expensive to build and to buy and to operate than a truck is, and that the trucking industry includes a very large number of sort of self-owned operators that run their trucks. So I do think that they're very different. I do think obviously they work in concert, because you need to have trucks to transport stuff that come by tankers or containers into the ports, but they do operate very differently. And I haven't studied the trucking industry as much as I should, but my sense is that because of the ownership structures of the vastly different ownership structures on both of those, I think it's going to be a very different kind of question. A quick question from Gareth, who says, your work draws on both archival and ethnographic methods. Can you talk a little bit about this? Is there much overlap? And for example, do you use ethnography to understand archives? Let me think about this. There are some overlaps. In some ways, I use ethnography to illuminate or complicate the archives. We know that the archives, particularly of the industry in the Arabian Peninsula, are written by those in power. I looked for and found, thankfully, some memoirs and accounts by workers, so stories from below, and I did loads of interviews, and obviously that inevitably complicates the archival material. And I do find that they're both indispensable, because in a sense what you need is the voice of power, which is often congealed in the archive, and you need the voice of the others that complicates that powerful story. I also find that actually having multiple archives is really interesting. So the BP archives in particular complicates the story that one gets in the UK National Archives. So that was pretty interesting for me as well. Jeannie, so a more historical footnote. Onassis tried to build an offshore oil terminal on the Isles of Shoals here on the coast of New Hampshire. The terminal proposal was defeated by a local coalition of marine scientists and environmentalists. I wouldn't be surprised. Onassis managed to generate extraordinary reactions, some of which was, when one reads his memoirs, some of which was very much kind of like the reaction that the Arab buying of ports generated during the time of George Bush, some of it based on national chauvinism, some of it based on labor concerns, some of it based on environmental concerns. But in the case of Onassis, the fact that he was this kind of a larger-than-life figure and went on to marry Jackie Kennedy obviously made him a much more complicated figure as well. But I didn't know about that, and that's a really interesting thing. Yeah, he had a finger in every pie having to do with shipping, which makes it very interesting. Okay, a couple more questions, and then 3 more questions, and then I'm going to go on ahead and wrap it up. The next question is from a person who lives in Rotterdam, a place actually that I've done a bit of research in. Many citizens do not get to participate in the logistics and infrastructures of the port of Rotterdam because, of course, it's 50 kilometers out to the sea. The process of logistics is invisible except as a form of cultural imaginary. In what ways can the politics of logistics and infrastructure be brought to the citizens of a port city that, say, may challenge us or reflect on these political processes? So I think that's a very good, fantastic question. And quickly, I will say that one of the interesting things that I have found is that every time I go to a port, and I've done this in Rotterdam on a number of occasions, is I take port tours. And these port tours, actually, the one that you can take in Rotterdam in the summer takes you actually to the seaport, the new gateway, Rotterdam Gateway port. So you can actually check that out. But it shows you nothing about the life of labor there. Now, however, having said that, I just recently gave a talk in Rotterdam at Erasmus University, and one of the things that I found fascinating was that half the audience were actually sailors or people involved with the Rotterdam port. So I do think that there is an interest in this conversation, and if the sailors can be brought into universities or the sailors can be brought into the public and art spaces, I think that would be one way that this imaginary could be made much more real. I think it's a much more difficult thing in a place like Marseille, where the inner city ports are now completely tourist havens. They're no longer working ports like Rotterdam's port is. And I think that that actually produces interesting questions, which I don't really have an answer to. And so for that reason, I'll refer you to Alan Sekula, because I think he has reflected on that question and he might say something about it. I think there's a lot of interest in ports right now, arts exhibitions, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think that that could be one way that that imaginary could be made real. Okay, and finally, the last question by Yael. Can you speak more about the mechanisms that give sovereignty to Aramco? I would really, really strongly recommend an article by Nathan Citino, but also the memoir of Judge Stephen Schwabel about the subject, both of which you can find in my book on the chapter on law. And the arbitration, essentially, the chapter on law talks about how the concession agreements, both for the ports and for oil, in fact being understood as a kind of a sovereign moment, and as a kind of a fragment of sovereignty being detached from the national states and being given to these international oil companies. And so that, to me, is the mechanism by which it happens, through the arbitration, through the force of law, through the force of boycott, and where all of those things don't work, through military coercive force, is how sovereignty is embedded in these international oil companies. Okay, I think at this point I should probably wrap up. I want to thank you all for brilliant questions. And I also want to say I am extremely grateful to the Graduate School of Design for continuing to hold this talk with me here. And I'm grateful for you and for your brilliant questions. And I hope to see you guys at a later date, hopefully in real life, once we're all out of quarantine. Take care and stay well. Bye-bye.